Um, Welcome to Jewish Online Magazine. My name is David Barry, and my special guest today is Reverend Michael Binstock MBE. Welcome to Jewish Online Magazine, Reverend Binstock.
Thank you very much indeed.
We're going to be speaking to Reverend Binstock about his role as Director of Jewish Chaplaincy. But before we speak, can I ask your opinion on the consequences of what happened in Manchester, where the two policewomen were murdered?
Horrendous. From what we've heard, and haven't had all the facts in yet, it would seem this was just an evil crime luring two police officers to their deaths. What possessed this man to do this has yet to be disclosed, but obviously it's a shocking crime and a terrible tragedy.
Do you think people are aware of the consequences once they have committed a crime?
Oh, some people are. Others are in denial. It varies, obviously, and we come across prisoners who recognise they've done wrong, full of remorse, and others don't recognise that they've committed any offence whatsoever.
And is there such a thing as a Jewish crime, would you say?
There's no such thing as a Jewish crime, because although fortunately we have a very small number of Jewish prisoners, to put it into context, we have something like 90,000 prisoners in England and Wales, and we have something like 200 Jewish prisoners throughout prisons in the country. It's a very small percentage, and we're very well underrepresented. However, the myth that all Jewish prisoners are there for white-collar crimes is a myth. In actual fact, all sorts of crimes are committed. Sadly, murder, paedophiles, drug-related offences, rape, burglary. Therefore, there's no such thing as a Jewish crime. But thankfully, and Baruch Hashem, the numbers are very low. And the other good thing is that whilst the rate of reoffending generally is very high, in the Jewish community it's quite low.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm certain it's because where there is a caring family to give support, a home to go back to, a job, a community that supports, these are very important factors.
And do you think sometimes prison is the answer?
Sometimes it is the answer, often it isn't. And the sad thing is that there are people who come back time and time again, even though they had resolved to go straight, but when they come out, they just can't make a go of it. They can't get employment. Some are just unemployable, and they leave prison without any prospects, with a few pounds in their pockets. They may have a hostel to go to for a short while. Some come out without any address to go home to. And so really the odds are against them.
And how did the Jewish chaplaincy develop and evolve?
Well,
and come into being?
That happened long before I came in on the scene, because the United Synagogue, which is the organisation responsible for Jewish chaplaincy, was running the service certainly long before I came in on the scene. I became a Jewish chaplain in 1969 when I moved back to London from the north, and I became the chazan of the Brixton Synagogue. And it just so happened that my predecessor, the late Rabbi Chaitovitz, was retiring, and he was the Jewish chaplain at Brixton and Wandsworth. And I took over from him, mainly because geographically it seemed common sense to have somebody in the area. In those days, prison chaplaincy was not as organised and as formalised as it is now. I literally took on the job without having had any training, any experience, anyone to mentor me. I just learned as I went along.
And what was it like when you first went into your first prison, what was it like for you?
I suppose it's really like diving into the deep end of a
Yes.
swimming pool when you can't really swim very well.
Were you scared and nervous?
I wasn't scared, no, but it was daunting, and I literally had to learn as I went along, and I made many mistakes. Fortunately, there were officers around who guided me and put me wise, but when I think about it, it was really quite horrendous, and not unlike Jewish education, as I recall many, many years ago, when anybody could get a job as a teacher, whereas now, of course, teachers, the Imre Kodesh teachers, are highly professional and qualified.
And what is the role of a Jewish chaplain?
Very simply, to provide for the religious and spiritual needs of prisoners. In that respect, chaplaincy is no different to university chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincy. We're there to provide for their religious needs, whatever those needs may be. Now, obviously, we have Jewish prisoners from extreme non-observance to fairly traditional, to very traditional, to religious, and to the ultra-religious. And it's a question of providing for those needs.
Is that a contradiction where somebody can perhaps call themselves religious and end up being in prison?
You know, there's a famous posuk that we say, unfortunately to the Bible, we say, in Sadik Bo'oris, Asher Yaseh Tov V'lo Yechtor. There's no such thing as a righteous person, only does good and hasn't sinned. And as chaplains, we are totally non-judgmental. It's not for us to make judgment, to treat prisoners differently depending on the nature of their offence. We also deal with people on remand, so technically they are innocent because they haven't yet been convicted. And there are people who are there, unfortunately, through sad circumstances. Not every criminal is a nasty, evil person who has committed a premeditated crime. To give you just one example of a person who found himself in prison because he unfortunately got himself lost. He was in a one-way street in an area he was unfamiliar with. He wasn't from this country. He knocked down somebody and he panicked and he ran away. And he was caught and he was imprisoned. So to say that all prisoners are just nasty people who should be locked up isn't the case. On the other hand, prison is necessary for certain types of offences.
And has there been any experiences where a Jewish prisoner has found God in prison?
Yes, very much so. That does happen because, as we know, human nature is such that when we are in trouble, we find religion, whether it's a bereavement, whether it's a tragic event. Now, I'm not saying that every prisoner who's found God in prison comes out and maintains that. And the truth is that we don't have contact with prisoners once they leave, and they don't want contact with us. We're there whilst they're in prison, and when they come out, they want to put prison and probably everyone that they've seen there in the past and move forward. It's only sadly when we do see them back that we're there perhaps to pick up the pieces and give them more chizuk, more encouragement and help. But it is interesting how many prisoners I have helped, Jewish prisoners, helped to read Hebrew. I have a class of 3 or 4 in a prison called Huntercombe, which is in Oxfordshire, where I'm teaching them Judaism from scratch. They are genuinely interested. So it is a fact that when they're in prison...
Why do you think that is? Is it to perhaps being cynical for them to have extra privileges, maybe?
Well, they don't have extra privileges if they actually genuinely want to study. A Jewish prisoner is certainly entitled to kosher food,
right?
As a basic requirement. They have rights to be able to daven, to put on tefillin.
Are they really? They can put tefillin on?
Absolutely.
Really? Even with the problem that maybe they might be suicidal, chas v'shalom.
Well, prisoners who are suicidal are looked after and on watch, possibly on a 24-hour watch. So the prison system does look after and care for people they feel vulnerable.
And are they able to perhaps, double in a minute if there are perhaps 10 prisoners?
Well, fortunately, I'm not aware of any prison at the moment where there is a minion.
Right.
It's the one place where I'm very delighted to say there isn't a minion.
Right.
But interestingly, in Pentonville there is still a synagogue, there's still a shul. Not that it's used that often. I remember when I first went to Wandsworth and I went to Brixton, we had a shul in both those prisons. But through lack of use, because they weren't needed, the prison commandeered them, they needed the space. And now prison chaplaincy, which is a multi-faith prison chaplaincy, is going down the road of a multi-faith chaplaincy. And therefore we have what's called shared space,
right?
And it is used for different faiths.
Okay. So apart from the privileges you've mentioned of kosher food and the freedom of worship, is there any other privileges that a Jewish prisoner might have?
Not really, because all prisoners of all faiths are entitled to worship their own religion,
right,
as appropriate. So I don't think they're getting any particular privileges. In fact, I would say it's the opposite, because prisoners who do choose to have a kosher diet reduce their options from the main kitchen, which is an interesting point. So, no, I don't think that they're getting extra privileges. The privileges, or the rights as I prefer to refer to them, are there for genuinely Orthodox prisoners.
Would a Jewish prisoner be able to observe the Sabbath, the Shabbat?
Absolutely, in every respect, yes. Prisoners are entitled to be released from work on Yom Tov.
Right.
Shabbos it doesn't apply because they don't work on weekends.
Oh, okay.
But a midweek Yom Tov, if they have a good job in the prison, they are entitled not to work without any danger of losing that job. So religion is respected in the prison, and I have to say that the prison service really is quite amazing, the extent to which they are prepared to go to meet prisoners' needs. And to give you an example, last year there was a prisoner who was due to be released literally on the first day of Sukkot.
Right.
Last year that happened to be a Thursday. And we were able to, with a certain amount of effort, persuade the prison service to release that prisoner on Erev Yom Tov, because he was Orthodox, and Thursday was the first day Yom Tov, Friday the second day, and then Shabbos. There were 3 days in a trot, and it was really quite rare, and I don't think it's happened before, that a prisoner was actually released prior to his official release date, for this reason.
With the Sukkot fast approaching,
right.
they're all loving the etrog.
Well, that is not a problem. The prisoner may have that where required. I have no prisoners at the moment that I'm caring for where they are of that level of orthodoxy that they require that, but it is certainly permitted. And I will surprise you that 2 or 3 years ago I had a Hasidic Jew in Wandsworth, and the authorities allowed him to have a sukkah.
Wow.
A pop-up
sukkah.
Yes.
Wow.
And he was allowed to have one meal a day in that sukkah.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. And so when you visit the Jewish prisoners, are you able to report back to their families on their progress?
I don't need to. Obviously, I can be in touch with families where necessary, but prisoners now are able to make contact with their families themselves. They're able to make phone calls. They purchase a special phone card, and they're allowed to make calls to people that they have registered with. Obviously, it's controlled naturally, but they are able to make contact. But there are times when I am asked to make contact with the family, particularly if it's abroad, and I would do that, yes.
And has any Jewish prisoner decided to stop having a dialogue with God once he's entered prison?
I'm not aware of any prison actually done that. I will meet with all Jewish prisoners. Only once can I recall a prisoner refuse to see me.
Right.
And prisoners have that right, and we as chaplains may not force ourselves on prisoners. If they don't wish to see us, that is their right, and we respect that. But all prisoners, with one or two exceptions, will want to see us, and we're not there to ram religion down the throat. We're there very much.
There can be a comfort though, can't it?
Well, that's it. It can be, but I'm there, and I see my role, and that the role of all other Jewish chaplains, as indeed chaplaincy generally, is there very much to say, look, whatever you've done wrong, we in the Jewish community are not rejecting you, and we're there to offer a hand, friendship, and say, look, please God, there will be better times ahead.
And as director of the Jewish Chaplaincy,
Yes.
do you have to have chaplains representing the whole spectrum of
Yes,
Judaism?
I'm responsible for all the prisons in England and Wales. Scotland has its own prison service. Now, I am very fortunate. I have a very dedicated team, colleagues, and we.
So does that mean you have to have colleagues from Chabad and the Reform movement
Yes,
and
yes.
Conservatives?
Yes, it is actually a cross-community chaplaincy. I have over 40 colleagues, men, women. Some 50% of those colleagues are pulpit rabbis. Others are lay chaplains, professional men, one or two retired people, business people, and they give up their time and they visit one or two or more establishments in any particular region.
And can the Jewish prisoner choose which chaplain he wants to chat with?
Well,
I mean, for instance, he might want an Orthodox
I see what
chaplain
you mean, yes.
rather than a
Very much.
Chabad or...
Yes. The way it normally would work is that if we have let's say we have a non-Orthodox chaplain in a prison, and the prisoner is Orthodox, will want to see an Orthodox rabbi, we work together as a team,
Right.
and we can facilitate that, and we do, absolutely.
Right. And we spoke about rehabilitation. Is it easy for Jewish prisoners to get back into the Jewish community, or they painted as being a criminal and they have that tag for the rest of their life?
It's an interesting question, and to some extent it will depend on how well known that particular prisoner was before the offence and before the imprisonment, and also the nature of that offence. But generally speaking, prisoners can and do move back into their communities if they so wish. Unfortunately, a good number of Jewish prisoners do not come from any Jewish community, have had absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish community. And they are more likely to reoffend because they don't have the support of the Jewish community. So in many ways, those who do belong to a community and do return to it are more likely to be able to be rehabilitated more successfully.
So they can lose the stain then, can they?
Hopefully they can. As I say, it is not our job to follow up when they come out of prison. I certainly do not have the resources available to me to help prisoners once they are out. There are organisations that can help. My role is specifically when they are in prison rather than when they come out.
Have any Jewish prisoners perhaps asked for your telephone number to perhaps keep in touch with you once they've left prison?
There are strict rules actually, the prison service, as to what extent we are able to maintain contact with them. Again, it's an issue of security that the prison service is concerned about.
Because obviously, in some instances, you're developing their interest in the Jewish culture,
Yes.
and once they leave prison, there might be possibilities that they might not continue that.
Well, that is a possibility. I mean, I try perhaps to give them links as to, and I speak to prisoners as they're coming towards the end of their sentence, as to what their plans are, and they just start thinking about what they're going to do when they leave. But as I said earlier, where they have a supportive family and a community to go to and a home to go back to, and hopefully a job.
I was going to talk about jobs.
Yes. Well, if they have all that, then they're not going to need me, and they're quite happy to, as it were, forget about me. And I'm happy that they should do that.
Is it difficult? Do you think, maybe speaking generally now, because I know you can't talk about specifics,
Sure.
about Jewish prisoners that have served their time, so to speak, to have an opportunity for employment? Because once people see that you've got a criminal record on your CV, in today's climate, very, very difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult. My experience is those that have the ability to be employed because they have a skill, then they will find work.
Do you think so?
I do, and I know for a fact. The problem is that many prisoners, and this is not so much the case with Jewish prisoners, although it does exist as well, that they are unemployable because they do not have any skills at all. And there are prisoners who sadly lack basic literary and numeracy skills. This is a very, very big problem.
Why do you think that is?
They've just failed through the education system. Perhaps they took a wrong turning early on in their life, and they were just unable to ever get going in terms of leading what we would call a normal life and progressing through their education.
Just getting back to this employment situation, there is a record amount of people unemployed today, and I hear maybe there's 200 people going for the same job today.
Yes.
And if somebody has a criminal record, it's very, very difficult, isn't it?
It is very difficult, and that's why I say if they do not have a job to go to,
but irrespective of that, is that stain of having a criminal record that is going to stop them having employment and settling back into the Jewish community?
It could do, although I'm glad to say there are people who appreciate the importance of helping somebody to rehabilitate, and it's a very big mitzvah, of course. The problem is that if somebody has no skills, and they therefore are just unemployable, then it is very, very difficult. They are more likely to reoffend, but many Jewish prisoners have either a job to go to, or they were their own boss. They had their own business, and therefore they naturally have that head start, and they're far less likely to reoffend. But it is perfectly true to say that those who don't have those benefits are very likely to reoffend, and there are some Jewish prisoners I've seen time and time again, unfortunately.
I mean, it's a mitzvah, isn't it, for the Jewish community to give these people a second chance?
It is. But they've got to be able to give something back as well. And there are sadly some prisoners, Jewish as well, who just do not have a work ethic. They're just so used to stealing if they want something, that the idea of knuckling down and doing a solid day's work is just alien to them. Now, by no means is that the norm, but there are some in that category, and for that reason, sadly, they are likely to reoffend.
And just going back to the Orthodox prisoner, what motivates an Orthodox prisoner to commit a crime that he knows is wrong?
I don't know, and as I said, we're not judgmental now. I don't really focus on this sort of area because I don't think it's very productive from my point of view. The main thing is that once they've served their sentence, that they go back into the community and they become useful and valued members of the community. That's the important thing.
And does the Jewish chaplaincy work with other faiths, other faith chaplains?
Well, every prison has a multi-faith chaplaincy.
Right.
And we are part of that team. And in every prison, there are the full-time chaplains. They are for the major faiths. obviously the Christian denominations and the Muslims, because there's a high proportion of Muslims in prisons. And then there are the minority faiths, and we are usually sessional chaplains. We're not employed by the prison service.
Is there any anti-Semitism in prison where maybe the Muslim prisoners or the Christian prisoners might start, so to speak, with the Jewish prisoner?
A prisoner in Wandsworth told me something many, many years ago, back in the early 70s when I first started, and I've never forgotten that. And he said, prison is one of the most tolerant societies.
Wow, really?
And I questioned that at the time. He was right, particularly now when in a prison like Wandsworth and others as well, you hear so many different languages, prisoners from all different parts of the world, and it's a melting pot. Everybody seems to get on. Now, is this anti-Semitism? Well, there may be some, but it is very, very limited. And prisoners of all faiths and none do get on, because at the end of the day, it's in their own interest to do so.
And has there ever been the case where a governor has come to you and said, do you think Mr. Goldstein, so to speak, Mr. Goldstein should be up for parole?
No, no prisoner's ever done that before. We don't have a very big say in deciding things like that.
Right.
This is done parole, because there's a parole board, and the system doesn't quite work like that. Governors, of course, today are very much like head teachers. They're almost site managers. To give you an example, in the larger prisons, such as Wandsworth, which is a very big prison, I seldom see the governor. Now, obviously, if I wanted to see him, I know where his office is, but it is most unusual for me to actually need to go and see the governor. And there are, of course, deputy governors and governors of wings, and the structure in a prison and the hierarchy is very interesting. So if I needed to see somebody in connection with a particular issue, I would go and see the person in charge of that particular department, rather than ever go to see and speak to the governor. It would be very, very rare that I would actually need to speak to the governor. It has happened, but it's very rare.
And does the Jewish chaplaincy go out to schools?
No, I mean, I'm invited to speak to organisations, and I have spoken to many, and I'm speaking...
Do you think you should, the Jewish chaplaincy should go to schools to tell the children about the consequences of crime, of a Jewish criminal? What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I have spoken in schools, but never to Jewish schools. I've been invited to speak to sixth formers in non-Jewish schools.
Right.
I would hope that Jewish schools have, within their own curriculum, teaching Jewish values, that it will be taken care of there, rather than me coming into and saying, this is what will happen if you're naughty. I'm not sure that would be necessary. I hope it would not be necessary if the Jewish schools are doing what they should be doing. And I know that they are, because with my other hat, I do Picard inspections.
Right. It's interesting, actually, Reverend Binstock. The Jewish situation with regard to prison is perhaps for the criminal to settle into a family environment, isn't it, for 6 or 7 years, and to perhaps develop themselves as a new human being rather than going to prison.
I'm not sure what the question is, though.
Well, from the Torah point of view, there isn't a concept of prison, is there?
Oh, you're right.
You spend 6 years...
Oh, I see. I see. You're from the center of Mishpatim. Well, yes, unfortunately, we don't work that system.
Which system do you think is the best system? That's not a fair question. Not the best system. That's not fair.
Well, let me answer the question this way. Do I think all the prisoners that I see should be in prison? No, I do not. But then, of course...
Do you think they would be better off in a family environment where perhaps they can learn family values, social values, rather than perhaps being in prison where it's difficult to learn that concept?
I'm not quite sure how that would work. What does concern me is that there are many prisoners, not just Jewish, but in the wider prison population, who have mental illnesses. And as a result of these mental problems, I have no doubt that they've committed crimes. And then, of course, you have drug addicts and sex offenders, and often they're not given the help that they need. And because of that, you're not really addressing the root cause of the problem. And that is why they will return time and time again. Now, does prison work? I've heard this discussion on the radio many times, and you have people phoning in saying, yes, it does, and other people say, no, it doesn't. My view is that there is no simple yes or no answer. In some respects, prison does work. It works, for example, by virtue of the fact that the public has been protected for the duration that the prisoner is in prison. Deterrent, well, we know that the rate of reoffending is high, but what we don't know is how many other people have been deterred from committing a crime because of the consequences of being detected and being punished. And we just we don't have those figures. How many people have been deterred from committing a crime? People have never committed a crime or never been charged with any offence because they have been deterred from doing so. So the deterrent factor may be quite high. We don't know that. But as for the prisoners themselves, yes, there are some for whom prison does work. They find prison a daunting experience. And at the end of the day, the worst thing about prison is the loss of freedom. People are not sent to prison to be punished. A prison sentence is the punishment. It's the loss of one's freedom. That is a tremendous punishment. And I've been in and out of prisons literally over the 42 years. I mean, how many hundreds of times, thousands probably. And whenever I'm out of the prison, I say Baruch Hashem. And I often wonder how people can just survive weeks, months, and years in custody. It's horrendous.
Do you think life should mean life?
It does, but it doesn't mean they're going to serve the sentence in custody. A life sentence is exactly that. Prisoners, though, most prisoners who receive a life sentence are released on licence. But that licence is for life, and they can be recalled at any time. So do I think that all people getting a life sentence should be there for the whole of their natural life? No, I don't. I think on the whole, the system does work well. Of course, there are occasions when tragically prisoners come out on licence and reoffend. There is a risk factor, and that risk has to be taken into account. And that is the major consideration in deciding when and if a prisoner is released on licence.
And have you ever met the victim of the crime?
Yes, I have. I have.
And?
The victims obviously are very subjective, and understandably so. But one has to look at the broader picture. And whilst I believe that the Torah has it right, when a person steals, the Torah, the punishment is that the person repays.
Yes.
Victims do not get repaid if they have been, they've lost. Naturally, if a person has committed a crime against them in terms of violence, etc., putting them in prison, they're protected from their activities.
And the victim of the crime that you've met, Reverend Binstock, would they ever be in a position, do you think, looking at hindsight maybe, to forgive the person that committed the crime?
There are those who can never forgive, and it would not be for me to judge them, because as we learn periodically, you don't judge somebody till you've been in that situation.
Absolutely, for sure.
I think people who are able to forgive are feel much better in themselves, because when you harbour this hatred, it destroys you. And I often have tremendous admiration. I hear on the radio for somebody who is asked, what are your feelings towards the person who's committed this crime? And they say, we want to move forward now, and I don't harbour any hatred towards them. I think that takes tremendous courage.
And do you think perhaps the criminal, in order to move on, needs to have this apology?
Well, I think it does help, and of course there is now a tried and tested system whereby prisoners and their victims meet, and obviously the prisoners and the victims have to be chosen. Both have to be in agreement to do so, and where that has taken place, both have benefited, because obviously the criminal learns a little bit more about what harm he or she has done.
And perhaps he wouldn't have done it.
Possibly so.
Had he known.
Yes, but the victim can also learn something about the troubled background that the criminals had, and have a more understanding view of them. It is actually a very valuable experience, but of course not everybody could feel they could do that, and again one must respect those feelings. But I certainly think that it is very valuable where it does take place.
And it's very, very comforting to know, just to conclude this, Benzor, it's very comforting to know that maybe there's 250,000 Jewish people in the UK, and such a small amount of Jewish criminals, Jewish crime.
Absolutely, and I think Jewish values, and as I said earlier, the family, the support that one has from one's family and one's community is without a doubt a very major factor in that.
And that's a very, very positive way to finish this. Reverend Binstock, it's been a really, really informative and interesting chat with you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Jewish Online Magazine.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.